Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. In this video we're going to be talking about the Wiggers diagram, and specifically we're going to be talking about the left heart Wiggers diagram, okay? Because both the left heart and the right heart have a Wiggers diagram, but we're going to only be talking about the left heart because that is where we're concerned about. That is where we push blood to the rest of the body, and the left heart can have more complications than the right, so we're looking at the left heart, okay? And when we talk about the Wiggers diagram, it's really important to understand the cardiac cycle, because all the Wiggers diagram is it's explaining the sequence of events that are occurring within one cardiac cycle, okay? It's explaining every sequence of event that is occurring within one cardiac cycle, and with that said, it has to look at a couple of things. It has to look at the electrical activity of the heart via the EKG. It has to look at the pressure of the aortic pressure, right? Because that's where we're going to push the blood into. We have to look at the left ventricular pressure, the left atrial pressure, and the volume of blood at the left ventricle. And of course, we have to look for any heart sounds, okay? So you can see how this is a very integrative diagram where it involves everything that occurs in the cardiac cycle. So if you haven't watched the cardiac cycle video, you have to go and watch that, okay? Go and watch that video and then come back. I'll link it here. Now, if you guys like this video, if it truly does help you, please consider subscribing, consider liking, maybe leave a comment. It does help the channel grow, it pushes the video. So let's get right into it, okay? So you guys have noticed that all of these colors coincide with the graph, okay, their respective graph. And another thing you will have noticed is that the y-axis is very specific here, okay? So the y-axis down here is specifically in milliliters, and the y-axis up here is in millimeters of mercury, okay? Because we're talking about pressures. Down here, we're talking about volume of blood. Now, another thing is, let's get started. Let's get started. So we're going to start at all of these little bits that I've numbered, okay? So first one is right over here, number 1. What do you notice? Well, in number 1, I can see the left atrial pressure and the left ventricular pressure. But what do you notice? You notice something, don't you? You notice that the left atrial pressure is slightly increasing. You see that? Here's the left atrial pressure. It is slightly increasing. Why? Why is the left atrial pressure slightly increasing here? Okay, and why is it higher than the left ventricular pressure? Okay, good question. If you guys remember from the cardiac cycle video, I mentioned that when the blood comes into the atria at first, okay, it is going to exert a pressure on the walls of the atria. So here we can observe it, right? Since we're talking about the left heart, let's focus here. The blood is coming into the heart, right? It'll put a kind of pressure inside of this actual atria, increasing the pressure to a point where the pressure in the atria becomes greater than the pressure inside of the ventricles, okay? And what that's going to do is that's going to open up the aortic valves. And when the the atrioventricular valves. And when the atrioventricular valves open, blood comes in. So what does that look like? Well, right here, you can see that the left atrial pressure is increasing, okay? It is higher than the left ventricular pressure, and that is due to the atria filling with blood, okay? The blood that comes into the atria exerts a pressure, makes the pressure in the atria greater than the ventricle, which causes the opening of the atrioventricular valves, okay? So that the blood starts to passively enter the left ventricle. And you might be saying, okay, well, where's your proof here? Well, look at this, okay? This exact time period correlates. As the pressure in the left atria is increasing, what do you notice? The volume of blood in the left ventricle is also increasing. So bear with me here. The pressure inside of the atria is increasing, opening up the atrioventricular valves, and now the blood that was in the atria is going and flowing into the left ventricle, increasing the left ventricular volume, okay? All of that is happening in tandem, meaning it happens together, okay? Now, what is the next sequence of events? Okay, so we talked about number 1, and we kind of talked about number 2, right? Which is the left ventricular volume slightly increasing, and that's because we opened up the AV valves. The third thing we got to talk about, if you remember from the cardiac cycle video, was that when we're in this first stage of the cardiac cycle, the ventricular diastole, okay? In this stage, we split it up into 2 parts. We had a part where we had passive filling, okay, which was just due to the blood coming into the atria, increasing the pressure, opening the AV valves, and allowing for blood to move freely, following gravity, down into the ventricles. But then we had another phase, which it actually was called active filling. It was called active filling, and that one involved the atria contracting. You can see that, okay? The atria are not as enlarged as they were in this phase, okay? They are contracted. So really, the ventricular diastole is 2 parts. There's the passive filling phase, and there's that active filling phase. And I'll tell you something right now, which we'll talk about. The passive filling phase can be split up into 2 parts, a rapid and a reduced filling part, okay? And actually, right now, we're looking at the reduced portion. But don't worry, we'll get to that part of the graph later in the video. Now, why am I even telling you all of this? Well, I'm telling you all of this because the ventricular diastole was 2 parts. It was the passive filling, and it was the active filling phase as well, okay? It was the phase where we had to generate a pressure inside of the atria by contracting the atria, okay? So when we're looking at this diagram, what would you first want to look for? Well, you would first want to look for a depolarization of the atria. Well, wait a second. Isn't a depolarization of the atria just a P wave? Yes, it is. And if you look at the electrocardiogram number 3, okay, if you trace it down all the way, you can exactly pinpoint the exact point where the atria starts increasing its pressure, okay? So here's the P wave, right? Which represents atria depolarization, meaning the atria are going to start contracting very soon. And what do you notice? Immediately after, the atrial pressure starts to increase. Why does it increase? It increases because the atria is starting to contract. And if the atria contracts, guys, what happens to the volume inside of the atria? It gets smaller, thus the pressure rises. That's Boyle's law. Okay? And that was number 4 right there. What happens when this atria contracts? Well, we know it's going to push blood into the ventricle, okay? But what did I say happens when blood comes into the atria or the ventricle? It exerts a pressure. So what do you also notice? Number 5, you also notice a simultaneous increase in the left ventricle pressure, okay? So one more time, we are in the ventricular diastole phase, okay? We talked about the passive filling a little bit, but now in the active filling phase, the atria has to contract. And when the atria contracts, we know is because of this actual P wave, okay? This P wave right here, if I were to trace down where it starts, okay, you can immediately see that as the P wave continues to go on, you will see a simultaneous increase in left atrial pressure, which means that they are contracting, the atria is contracting, and if they're contracting, guess what they're doing? They're pushing blood out into the ventricles. And if they're pushing blood to the ventricles, the pressure in the ventricle is going to increase simultaneously as well. How do we have proof that they're pushing blood into the ventricles? We'll just look at the left ventricular volume and see if it tracks. And lo and behold, it does. As all of this was happening, you can clearly see that the left ventricular volume was increasing with them. So this confirms what I've been talking about. Okay? Now, that's that. Now, this process of active filling will continue to occur until we reach the maximum amount of volume that we can fill this ventricle with. Okay? And that, my friends, is called the end diastolic volume. Okay? The end diastolic volume, number 7 here, okay? The left ventricle, you can see, reaches the EDV, which is around 135. It's around 135 milliliters, okay? And the EDV is just the volume of blood in the ventricles after a full atrial contraction, okay? Or you can say it's the volume of blood in the ventricles at the end of diastole, okay? Because this phase occurs at the end of ventricular diastole. But now you'll notice we'll go into this little blocked portion, this block-ish portion. Okay, what is this block portion? All right, well, this block portion, this portion has a different color than all the other ones, is the isovolumetric phases, okay? So this one's an isovolumetric phase, this one's an isovolumetric phase, this one's another one, this was another one, okay? And you'll see why I did that. It's on purpose, okay? I put it in a different color on purpose to make it very legible. Now, we went through steps 1 to 7 already. Pretty nice, pretty nice. So which phase of the cardiac cycle does phase 1 to 7 track with? Well, we know that it tracks with the ventricular diastole phase. Because look, I even drew it out for you guys. It starts out from here and here, and right before we get into that little block portion, which means that step 1 to 7 of the Wiggers diagram corresponds to this ventricular diastole. Okay, corresponds to the ventricular diastole portion. And you see how all of that made sense, okay? Everything that was happening for a reason, and it made sense. Now, what else? What else can we extrapolate? Where is number 8? Well, number 8 is the QRS phase. And you might be thinking, why here? Well, again, you have to know your cardiac cycle. Right after the ventricular diastole phase, where I filled up my ventricle to the brim after an atrial contraction, and I have an end diastolic volume of 135. Then something cool happens. At that point, the atrial ventricular valves close. And when they close, you'll notice that they make a sound, okay? They make a sound, this heart sound right here, okay? And that's the first heart sound. You can actually record heart sounds using a phonocardiogram. Besides the point, this is the first heart sound that we make. This is also called S1 or the lub sound. You guys know how the heart is always going lub-dub, lub-dub. Well, this is the first heart sound, the lub sound, and it's because of the closure of the atrioventricular valves. Again, we discussed this in the cardiac cycle video. But when we enter this isovolumetric systole phase, what did I tell you guys you have to always think of when you hear isovolumetric systole, or isovolumetric in general? You have to think that all of the valves are closed, okay? It's a sealed chamber. Every single valve is closed, but something special is happening. We are generating a pressure inside of the ventricles, okay? We're generating pressure inside of the ventricles, but isovolumetrically, meaning I'm not changing the size of the volume, but I am contracting in a way that I'm generating pressure, okay? If you need a detailed explanation, go to the cardiac cycle video. Now, what does that look like on the Wiggers diagram? Well, remember, the ventricles are contracting, so they require a depolarization wave. That's why number 8 is the QRS complex. That is the start of the QRS complex, where the ventricles are depolarizing, and it's not shown here, but the atria is also repolarizing at this point, okay? And you can see that in this diagram I drew. The atria are back to normal size. They're no longer contracted, okay? So what happens after number 8? What happens when the QRS complex occurs? Well, if you guys know and you remember and you've been listening to what I've been telling you, QRS is the depolarization of the ventricles. So what you'll expect to see is a contraction of the ventricles and a subsequent increase in the left ventricular pressure. Because remember, when we start contracting, we're generating pressure, okay? And I talked about this. We generate pressure in two ways. It's either when the blood is hitting the walls of the heart or when the muscle of the heart is starting to contract. So in this scenario, the muscle of the heart is starting to contract. And guess what, guys? Guess what? Number 9 right here. Okay, number 9. As soon as that QRS wave depolarizes the ventricles, here's what you're going to see. What you're going to see is that the left atrial pressure is going to drop below the left ventricular pressure, okay? And you might be thinking, why does the left atrial pressure drop? Well, it drops because the atria is relaxing, okay? Remember, the QRS is not only the site of ventricular depolarization, but it's also masking where the atria are repolarizing. So the pressure in the atria is also going to drop because their volume is going back up again. All right, and you can see that it drops to right before it contracted. All right. Now, another thing that's key with number 9 is not only is the left atrial pressure dropping below the left ventricular pressure, but you can see that it is really at this number 9 point that we are creating that first heart sound. Because remember, the atrioventricular valves, and in fact, all the valves in the heart are pressure operated. If the pressure inside of my atria becomes less than the pressure inside of my ventricle, guess what? The atrioventricular valves will close. And when they close, they make a sound, and that's the S1 sound, okay? And that is because of this point right here, number 9. You can see at this point, the left ventricular pressure in red is here, while the left atrial pressure is down here, okay? Just that slight little difference in pressure is enough to close the valves. Okay, now let's move on to number 10. Again, remember, number 10 is coming straight after what? Straight after that QRS, okay? So when the QRS is happening, that means the ventricles are depolarizing, they're contracting, they're generating pressure. And here's what you're seeing in number 10, this giant increase in the left ventricular pressure. If any of you guys have watched my cardiac cycle video, you will know that I mentioned the entire point of the isovolumetric systole phase is to build up a pressure gradient. Okay, it's to build up a pressure. And you can see this right here, that the left ventricular pressure rises from maybe a little above zero, just a little above zero, and it approaches approximately 80 millimeters of mercury, guys. Okay, so it goes all the way from 0 to 80 millimeters of mercury. But if you're taking a very close look, by the end of this isovolumetric systole phase, it is still less than this pink line, or that's pink, purple line. What is this purple line? That is the aortic pressure. So tell me something. If the left ventricular pressure is still less than the aortic pressure by the end of the isovolumetric systole phase, does that mean the semilunar valves are open or closed? And of course, the correct answer here would be that they are closed. Remember that they're pressure operated, and as long as the pressure in the ventricles is less than the pressure in the aorta, that valve will remain closed. But guess what? Not for long, because we're going to move from number 10 to number 11 very quickly, and we'll see that in the isovolumetric phase, the left ventricular volume doesn't change, and obviously, why would it? Because we're not bringing in blood from anywhere else. It's a sealed chamber at this point. So the blood stays the same at the end diastolic volume. And now if we move on to number 12, right here, this point, you'll see something. As soon as I generate enough pressure, aka as soon as my ventricle reaches about 80 millimeters of mercury, okay, guess what happens? Guess who else is at 80 millimeters of mercury? Well, in this resting condition at this point, the aortic pressure is around 80 millimeters of mercury. And guess what? The left ventricular pressure reaches 80, but as soon as it overtakes it, we're no longer in the isovolumetric systole phase. We now transition to this phase, the ventricular systole, from here all the way to here. Okay? All the way to there. Awesome, guys. Awesome. And you can see that at the ventricular systole part, the pressure on the actual left ventricle is actually rising. It's rising above the aortic pressure, which opens the aortic semilunar valves. And when the aortic semilunar valves open, guess what happens, guys? The blood starts to get ejected, okay? Now, some people have a very hard time understanding this part of the graph, okay? Where the left ventricular pressure is overlapping kind of with the aortic pressure. But don't worry, I'm going to explain this to you. So remember, at number 12, the aortic pressure is at 80 millimeters of mercury, but the left ventricular pressure is rising above the aortic pressure just a little bit to open the aortic semilunar valve. And this was at the end of the isovolumetric systole, like right at the end. At this point, no blood is being ejected. But as soon as I step here, at this point, where the pressure starts getting higher and higher from the left ventricle, then I start to eject blood. And you can see the peak point here, number 13, okay? Where the aortic pressure is going to rise, right? That purple guy, aortic pressure, is going to rise. Why is it going to rise? Well, it's rising because I am pushing blood into it, okay? I'm pushing blood from the left ventricle into the aorta, okay, which is just a giant elastic tube. So guess what? The blood that's coming into that aorta is going to exert a force on the walls of that aorta, okay? And remember, it's coming at a pretty high pressure too. It's coming at 120 millimeters of mercury almost. So whatever pressure we'll have inside of the ventricle will be almost transferred to the aorta. Now, another key point about number 13 is that while it is true that the aortic pressure is rising because we're pushing blood into it, what you'll notice is that it reaches near 120 millimeters of mercury, but it doesn't actually hit it. And another thing you'll notice is that this red line, the left ventricle pressure, it does actually hit 120. So you'll notice the left ventricular pressure is still higher than the aortic pressure. Even though they're both increasing at the same time, the left ventricle is just a little bit higher, which is still keeping those aortic semilunar valves open to maintain our ejection phase, okay, or systolic phase. All right. Now, since this is the ejection phase, we should probably take a look at the left ventricle volume, just to make sure we're actually ejecting the blood. And lo and behold, from number 13, where we were ejecting the blood, to number 14, you will see that as soon as we start this ejection phase, if I drag all the way down, this blood is going to almost in a linear curve fashion, or in a curvilinear fashion, go down from the left ventricle. And it'll continue to go down till the end of systole, ventricular systole. It'll continue to go down until the end of ventricular systole, where at that point we stop contracting, we stop ejecting blood, and we are left with this volume of blood in our ventricle called the end systolic volume. And that, guys, is about 65 milliliters. It's about 65 milliliters at rest. So we covered number 13, number 14, and number 15, okay? We're going to stop at the end systolic volume, and now we're going to take a look at, now that this QRS complex, the depolarization of the ventricles and the contraction of the ventricles, now that that is all done, what is the next phase? Well, the next phase, you guys probably are screaming it out at me, is the T wave, number 16. Number 16, guys, is the T wave. And if you guys remember from the cardiac cycle video, the T wave is the ventricular repolarization, okay? Ventricular repolarization wave. And in this scenario, you'd want to see a couple of things, and I'll talk about them. Right here, actually, number 17. At this stage, you're seeing two things. You're seeing that, well, the T wave has already started midway through the ejection phase, okay? So the repolarization wave has reached or started in the ventricles halfway through ejection, okay? And continues to go all the way throughout the isovolumetric diastole phase. But that's not the point that I want you to understand. What I want you to understand is that at this point where the wave of repolarization starts, you can see that we start decreasing the pressure in the left ventricle. Why is that so? Well, remember, we had to contract to generate pressure to get here, and that was because of the QRS, the depolarization wave. But now if the repolarization wave starts, what does that initiate? That initiates the relaxing of the myocardium of the heart. And if the myocardium of the heart is going to relax, look at what's going to happen. The pressure that we generated is just going to start dissipating. It's going to go down. And you'll see that it'll continue to go down. And at this singular point right here, okay, right before we enter this little block, which we said is isovolumetric diastole. If we stop right there, you'll notice something. You'll notice that the left ventricular pressure drops to a point where it becomes less than the pressure in the aorta. And remember, does the aorta stay still when we're pushing blood into it in the ejection phase? No, it doesn't stay still. Remember, guys, I told you that the aorta goes through this Wynn-Kessel effect, okay? And it is also stretching out its walls, okay, becoming this, almost 120 millimeters of mercury pressure, and then because of the elasticity of its walls, it'll push that blood out to the systemic circulation, and thus the pressure inside of the aorta is also dropping. But guess what? It doesn't drop all the way down just like the left ventricular pressure. It stops at a certain point because it always has to have circulating blood in it. And thus it drops to this point, okay? And at this level, at this point around, I don't even know what this is. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, it's around 98. At around 98, it has a greater pressure than the left ventricular pressure, okay? And what that is going to do, it's going to snap close the semilunar valves, okay? The semilunar valves will close as soon as I'm able to enter into the isovolumetric diastole phase. And that, guys, if we track it down, if we track down number 17 all the way, you'll see is the cause for the second heart sound. Because the aortic pressure is dropping down and the left ventricular pressure is dropping down, but the left ventricular pressure drops down greater, that means it becomes lower than the aortic pressure, it's going to snap close the semilunar valves, causing the second heart sound, or the S2 sound, or the dub sound, if you want to call it, the lub-dub. Okay, so now you know what the second heart sound is. It's because of the semilunar valves closing. What else, guys? What else? What else? What's after number 17? Number 18, this little weird bit right here. And this is actually strongly correlated to what we just talked about, okay? When the semilunar valves close, okay, they produce this little bump in the curve called the dicrotic notch. Okay, it's a notch. It's a little notch in the curve. But why is it there? Why is it there? Well, it's there, guys, because when the semilunar valves close, okay, which happened right here at this 17 point, they're going to cause a sudden increase, a slight increase, in fact, in the aortic pressure, okay, just because it closes very rapidly, and it causes a slight increase in pressure, which then dies back down. That's a dicrotic notch. This is how we can tell if the semilunar valve closed or not, okay? Without, for example, looking at the second heart sound. So that's that. That's what the dicrotic notch is caused by. And at this point, when the semilunar valves close, guys, we're going to enter into the second isovolumetric phase called the isovolumetric diastole, okay? And in the isovolumetric diastole phase, well, what do you think we're going to do? We're going to reverse everything that we did in the isovolumetric systole. So now the pressure that I've generated initially here is going to go down. It's going to go down. And in this phase, the heart is just chilling. It's just relaxing. Okay, all of the ventricular myocytes are going through repolarization. Okay, you can still see that repolarizing wave here. And they are just relaxing. And they're going to relax all the way down to here. But before I tell you where that is, let's take another quick look at the volume inside of the left ventricle during the isovolumetric diastole. And of course, it doesn't change, because why would it? All valves are closed. Now let's come back to this point here. At this point, you're starting to see something. Number 21. What does that tell you? Number 21 is telling you that the left ventricle is relaxing so much so that it goes back to its initial state. Remember how I said it was originally starting from 0 and goes up to about 80? Well, guess what? It goes back to around 0 again. All right? It's going to relax so much that its pressure is going to fall right underneath right underneath, at the end of isovolumetric diastole, the left ventricular pressure goes down so much that it goes underneath the left atrial pressure. And if that occurs, guys, we're opening what? What valve? The atrioventricular valve. We're opening the atrioventricular valve to initiate the next cardiac cycle. And so you can see that at this phase, at this point, the first cardiac cycle finished. But now we can start up the next cardiac cycle, okay? And let's do that just to finish up the numbering. So one more time at number 21, we can see that from number 19, the isovolumetric diastole phase, we were just relaxing. We were relaxing, and if we were relaxing the heart, what would happen to the space inside of the actual heart? We'll take a look at it. Initially, it was like this. It was very contracted, but then it will go back and look like this bulbous shape. Okay? So you can see that the space inside of the ventricles is increasing, and if the volume inside of an area is increasing, the pressure in that area is decreasing. That's Boyle's law. Okay? Not only that, remember that the myocytes were contracting and generating pressure, and if they're no longer contracting but relaxing, they're not generating that kind of pressure either. So pressure is going down, 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 and it drops below the left atrial pressure in green. And at this point, you can see that the atrial pressure is rising as well. Why was the atrial pressure rising? Well, the atrial pressure was rising at this same time because it was getting filled with blood. Okay, it was starting to get filled with blood. So remember, just because you're in isovolumetric diastole, which is right here, doesn't mean that the atria are not getting their blood. Okay? The atria actually start getting their blood at the late portions of the isovolumetric diastole. And you can see that right here. You can see that right here. They're going to start getting their blood, slightly increasing their pressure to what? To overcome the pressure of the left ventricle that was dropping down already. And when they do that, the combination of both of those events will open up the atrioventricular valve and allow for what to happen? Allow for what to happen, guys? Ventricular filling to occur. So 21 and 22 are working together there. And when we look at number 23, which is the left ventricular volume, now we can start seeing the results. Remember how I said after this phase, you come back to the original phase here and you start up the new cardiac cycle with the ventricular diastole, which we said you can split into the passive filling and the active filling. Well, you're going to start off at the passive filling first. But remember, I said the passive filling can be two parts, rapid or reduced. If we look at it, as soon as we exit this point, what's going to happen to the atrial pressure? The atrial pressure is dropping, and so is the left ventricular pressure. Okay, why is the left ventricular pressure dropping? Well, it's dropping back to its baseline still, and it stops about here. Okay, it stops around here, and remains baseline for a while. But the left atrial pressure, why is it decreasing here? Well, it's decreasing, guys, because there was blood filling into it over here, but now that the AV valve's opened at this point, it's going to let go of that blood passively into the ventricles. And when it does that, the pressure inside of the atria goes down because there's no longer any blood in it. And you can correlate this directly with the volume of blood in the left ventricle. You can see that as this atrial pressure goes down, the left ventricular volume is starting to go up, which indicates that blood is passively flowing from the atria into the ventricle. And that's the rapid filling phase. But you can see that it stops. At one point it stops right over here, or around here you can say. It kind of plateaus off and there's a reduced filling, okay? And that's because there is no longer any blood returning to the atria. So guess what? Its pressure just goes back to what it is normally, okay? Right here, this baseline normal. And this, at this point of the story, or I should say at this point of the story, right here, is where we entered in, right here. So this point and this point are the exact same. We entered in at the reduced filling phase. We entered it in step 1, step 2, and all of that. And so we're going to repeat the exact same thing, okay? What's going to end up happening is Number 24 was our reduced filling. Why did we have reduced filling? Well, we had reduced filling because, like I mentioned, the gradient from the atria is starting to go down, right? It's not getting as much blood that's passively flowing down. And what that's going to do is, very, very quickly, very soon, number 25 occurs, the P wave. The P wave causes atrial depolarization. And any remaining amount of blood that is inside of the atria will get pushed out. How do we know it's getting pushed out? Well, just look at the left atrial pressure. The left atrial pressure rises, okay, and then falls back again, which means what? If it raised, that means that the atrial myocytes contracted. How do we know that? Well, they contract and they push blood into the ventricle. And you can correlate that down here. They contract, they push blood, boom, into the ventricles, and then we reach the end diastolic volume, which was right here. Okay, and then from there, the pressure of the left ventricle, which was rising as it was getting filled with blood, what happens to it? It will suddenly rise past the left atrial pressure to a point where it closes the atrioventricular valves, and then we enter into the isovolumetric systole phase again, okay? All of that is correlated with the cardiac cycle very closely, and that's because it is the cardiac cycle. All we are doing in the Wiggers diagram is just graphing the cardiac cycle, okay? Now, that's going to finish it for the actual interpretation parts. What else can we do here? Well, I can tell you the steps and where they correlate exactly. Okay? So, for example, the ventricular diastole was step 1 through 7. Okay? And you can see that all over here. This phase, from this phase, was 1 through 7. What else? The isovolumetric systole phase. Where is that? Well, that's actually steps 8 to 12. Step 8 all the way to 12. How do you know that? Well, just look at where we start, okay? Well, step 8 is the start of that QRS complex. You can see it right here. And at that point, where are we? We're in the isovolumetric systole phase, which means what? Which means that you can just track everything there. So 8, number 9, what else? Oh, this got erased actually, but this is number 9, this part right here. And then you can track number 10, which is right here, right? And then number 11, number 12, right? Everything that's basically in that block, okay, right here is 8 to 12. And then the ventricular systole phase, guys. The ventricular systole was steps 13 all the way to 16. And then the isovolumetric ventricular diastole was 17 to 22. And technically, guys, if you want to include the rapid and reduced filling, we can actually add on to the ventricular diastole phase because, remember, we started the video off at this portion, not this portion. So we can actually add on to it, and we can say that steps number 23 to 25 are also included in the ventricular diastole phase, okay? All right, guys. That's going to finish it with the interpretation of the Wiggers diagram. I hope it made sense to you. I hope it helps. If it did, please let me know down in the comments section. If you have any questions about the Wiggers diagram, anything I can clarify, again, feel free to ask in the comments section. Please like and subscribe if this truly did help you, and share the video. Next video will be on the cardiac output and how we regulate it. I will see you guys there.